Hello, this is Dr. Tim Merritt coming at you live from the flight deck of the St. Paul. In the 2020 Knowledge Base of Future Studies, researcher Brian Johnson explained how generations of scientists have had their imaginations set on fire by science fiction stories. His article inspired me to explore science fiction world building as a means of influencing social change and transforming the turbulence of our times. I built my imaginary world around this 300-foot-long Lockheed Martin hybrid airship, the St. Paul. The airship belongs to the Perusia International Relief Agency, or PIRA, a Christian humanitarian relief organization. I've set the adventures for the St. Paul and her crew in the decade of the 2030s. But the story we will be discussing today does not directly involve the St. Paul. This story takes place 10 years earlier. It is a backstory for some of the St. Paul's future crew members. Can You Survive the Ukraine War is a choose-your-own-adventure story that follows the imaginary exploits of the PIRA disaster response team as they deal with real issues facing us today. I'm introducing this story as a proof-of-concept novel for the Foresight method called directed fiction, and I'm proposing that this technique can be used to judge between competing narratives in a postmodern society. Now, I'll land the St. Paul and you can come aboard and we can talk about it. Welcome to the St. Paul. The main cabin is a little cramped, but find a seat and we can get started. Many futurists have thought about the role science fiction plays in anticipating and even designing critical sectors of society. Let's take a look at three researchers who have heavily influenced my own work, Professor Jim Dater and researchers Alex Fergnani and Xiaoli Song. Here's Dr. Olivia Newsom to tell you more.
Hello, my name is Dr. Olivia Newsom, and I am one of the characters from the novel, Flight of the St. Paul. In 1979, Professor Jim Dater developed the Manoa School's Four Futures model. He argued that all of the millions of specific images of the future are variations of four generic narratives he designated as growth, collapse, discipline, and transformation. Building on Dater's work, researchers Fergnani and Song extracted images of the future from a set of 140 science fiction films and proposed a more nuanced series of 6 archetypes. Dr. Merritt has decided to concentrate his own work within the disarray archetype, because in his view, this most closely resembles the time period we find ourselves in. The disarray archetype can be described as one in which all the critical sectors are failing, and the environment is the antagonist. By applying the tools of strategic foresight to this archetype, Dr. Merritt developed the idea for directed fiction. Let's take a closer look at the process.
It all starts with framing. This step is essential for both managing bias as well as prioritizing end states. Horizon scanning must be done from the perspective of the story's protagonist. The star represents the character's enduring values, the mountain is the goal the character seeks to achieve, the chessboard is the array of problems between the character and the goal, and the self includes both the character's strengths and weaknesses. Unlike horizon scanning, the steeple analysis is not focused on character. Remember, in the disarray archetype, the environment is the enemy. How will these 7 factors inform the scenarios the character encounters? The axis of uncertainty is the heart of directed fiction. All of the previous analysis is used to build this model. To select the axis, first decide on which trend will have the most impact on your research question. Then decide which trend you have the least control over. This builds a broad spectrum of uncertainty, which is used to create the scenarios. Something I do a little different is to add the center surprise-free scenario in the middle. You will see how these 5 scenarios are used to develop the plot lines. This is the axis of uncertainty model that I built for the book, Can You Survive the Ukraine War? In the center is a surprise-free end state. At the start of the war, nearly everyone thought Russia would win it quickly. Landmarks 1A and 1B both reflect the vertical escalation of violence axis. Landmarks 2A through 2D reflect the relative chaos of the global economy on the horizontal axis. Let me demonstrate how these landmarks and end states form the structure of the book. Beginning with the initial conditions, the reader must make a series of decisions that lead to separate landmarks. Each landmark becomes one of 15 interconnected short stories, leading to 5 plausible outcomes. The reader only has to read 4 short stories to get from beginning to end of the adventure. However, contained within the book are 8 separate and distinct plotlines with hyperlinked navigation buttons that allow the reader to switch back and forth, exploring alternative futures. But before we go any further, we really need to talk about the role of plot in fiction. When I attended Regent, they taught me to write in all kinds of different ways. I wrote research papers, exegetical analysis, and articles for popular press and scholarly journals, just to mention a few. I was never taught to write fiction, but I thought, how hard could it be? It turns out that writing fiction is a lot harder than you might think. And we should consider adding a course in fiction writing to the Regent Foresight curricula. James Scott Bell is the #1 best-selling author of Plot and Structure and award-winning thrillers like Final Witness. He won the Christie Award for Excellence in Inspirational Fiction and is currently a fiction columnist for Writer's Digest magazine. He argues that either through intention or accident, the vast majority of fictional works followed this thematic formula. There is the inciting incident, the push that creates a sense of urgency, followed by the first plot point, the key event that makes it impossible to turn away. The story's midpoint is a major turning point in which the character is forced to make an important decision. The second plot point shows your character's most significant defeat. Then there's the story's climax, followed by a brief resolution. What's more, successful writers, editors, and publishers also understand this popular thematic formula. Now I have 8 separate plot lines in my story. You might be wondering, how do I keep track of them all? It's not easy, but I found the Fictionary software to be an incredibly powerful tool for managing plot lines. I just drop in 4 short stories, and the program calculates my story arc against the standard story arc. You can see each of the 5 elements displayed along the black line, while my story arc is displayed in tan. Let me show you how to adjust that line. This is the Fictionary dashboard. It allows you to go scene by scene and adjust each one according to 38 separate dimensions of fiction. In a choose-your-own-adventure novel, the early scenes are used over and over, so it keeps the editing down to a manageable level. You can see that this is the opening scene, which I designated here as the inciting incident. Every good story has a protagonist. I'd like to introduce Travis Cragen to help me explain how competing narratives can be judged.
Hello, I'm Travis Cragen, the protagonist for the book Can You Survive the Ukraine War? I serve as the PIRA Response Team Leader, RTL. So, everyone just calls me the Rattle. Hey Doc, I've got a question.
What's that, Rattle?
It seems you've gone to a lot of trouble to write all these stories. Wouldn't it have been easier to just write one regular story? What's the point of all this?
Well, that's a great question. I want to do something more than just write another story pushing my own narrative. I want to judge between competing narratives. That's what directed fiction is designed to do. I think we can transform the turbulence of our times by helping people see that any issue they care about can be viewed along a probability zone of outcomes.
So, you want to judge between competing narratives? What exactly is a narrative?
The best explanation of narratives I've ever seen comes from the book Radical by Maajid Nawaz. In it, he describes how, as a young Pakistani boy growing up in Birmingham, England, he and his friends were terrorized by a gang of skinheads brandishing hammers, knives, and baseball bats. The eldest Pakistani boy approached the skinhead leader and told him he had explosives in the green backpack, and that as a Muslim, he was not afraid to detonate it. This is a true story that took place right after the 9/11 attacks. There were no explosives in the backpack. That was a lie. But the skinheads believed it and fled. Nawaz learned that day that the stories we tell bring us power, literally the power of life and death. This is a lesson of postmodernism. Controlling the narrative is all that matters. Another tool to visualize the global contest over narrative is the Overton Window. first proposed by American policy analyst Joseph Overton, this popular model shows how previously impossible policies can become politically acceptable. The basic idea is that someone in a position of authority, frequently an academic, will make statements that are so radical and unthinkable that society will be dragged along to accepting new positions as policy. In response, political opponents will make their own radical and unthinkable statements to drag society in another direction. This ultimately leads to extreme polarization and even the destruction of society. So, Rattle, can you see how the postmodern focus on narratives is literally tearing our country apart?
Well, yeah. Now I understand what narratives are. But Doc, how does your book compare them?
Do you see all these landmarks and end states?
Yeah, I see them now.
Each one represents someone's narrative. Directed fiction is a collection of narratives laid side by side. We've also learned that a lot of narratives are just lies designed to be so radical and unthinkable that their only real purpose is to move the needle of public acceptance.
Too bad we can't bet on which ones are true and which ones are lies.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. The good news is that we can.
Betting on narratives is not technically correct. There are several prediction markets including Predictit, Metaculus, Polymarket, 538, and Augur. These are sites where researchers can make quantifiable predictions that generate measurable outcomes. Dr. Merritt is the only researcher who is tying specific predictions to competing narratives. The site he prefers is Metaculus, shown here. This example, focusing on a nuclear detonation, shows the community's prediction. Dr. Merritt's prediction is here. This is the range of points possible. Let's take a closer look.
Here are all of the odds for all of the landmarks and end states. These are not exact matches, but they're pretty close. The truth is that I only found out about the prediction markets after I finished my book about the Ukraine war. I was getting expert analysis from so many different sources that I didn't know what to believe. Like many of you, I found myself arguing with friends and family members. I realized that all of us struggle with the issue of bias. You can see that these questions aren't exact matches to my landmarks and end states. However, in the next directed fiction stories I write, I now have the ability to craft questions on Metaculus that are exact matches. Over time, with improved Foresight models and the experience gained through a track record of prediction successes and failures, I believe the technique of directed fiction will be able to produce remarkably accurate forecasts. Tying competing narratives to these types of quantifiable outputs is a game changer. Now, instead of obsessing over controlling the narrative, researchers will be focused on discovering the narrative that is closest to the truth. It's literally the opposite of the postmodern worldview. The postmodern worldview has led us into dangerous times. The desperate quest to gain power through control of the narrative has brought about an age of deception. Jesus warned us not to be deceived. This is why directed fiction was created. Well, this has been a nice visit. I've truly enjoyed getting an opportunity to discuss what I've been working on, and I sure hope I haven't overwhelmed you with too much information. The takeaways are these. When it comes to directed fiction, you use the tools of Foresight to set up your landmarks and end states and tie those to real-world outcomes. Simple, right? The St. Paul's crew has begun the pre-flight checks, so I'm going to have to jump back in the flight deck to prepare for takeoff. But before I go, I'd like to leave you with just one more thought. Regent University's mission statement is Christian leadership to change the world. If you're not using fiction to change the world, you can be assured that people with worldviews that are diametrically opposed to yours are using it to further their agendas. Fiction has a profound ability to shape worldviews. If someone believes something that isn't true, fiction provides the means to adjust course in a way that's probably hardwired into the human condition. Let me show you what I mean. In 1962, Thomas Kuhn developed the concept of paradigms. He used it to describe the way in which the scientific community develops an ever-changing consensus about what is true. In 2020, while working on an analysis of the walkaway movement, I noticed a pattern where people changed their political affiliations because of anomalies like corrupt leaders and inconsistent principles, and crisis over failure to deliver results and overwhelming extremism. Then they began comparisons with other worldviews. I did my research, they said over and over again. Finally, they adopted the new worldview and tend to become outspoken advocates. Now, look what happens when you lay the basic pattern for a plotline against these. Directed fiction gives the reader the ability to jump between competing plot lines. This could probably become the subject for another paper, but we're out of time. So for now, I'll just have to let it linger out there as an intriguing possibility. Thank you again for meeting me aboard the St. Paul. There's an accompanying research paper for today's presentation with links to more detailed information about directed fiction. There will also be a link to my proof of concept novel, Can You Survive the Ukraine War? Please watch your step as you disembark the aircraft. Visit my website to help me launch the St. Paul. Subscribe and never miss an update. The adventure is just beginning.